So if you would open up the IEP, it's that South Dakota Department of Education website. Go all the way to the end to Special Education Title Services. Go down, click on the individual education program just like we did the other day. And it seems to me we've already covered the first page. And we've already covered the second page. And we've already covered the third page. And we covered page 4A. Remember, that is high school transition. And we talked a little bit about page 4B, which is still high school transition. Those were the activities. And we stopped right at page 5, which are our educational goals and objectives. This is where we make goals and objectives for any area that the student needs improvement. How will we know what the areas are that the student needs improvement in? From the test. And also, what page on this IEP will we find it? That big blank page, page 2. Present levels of academic and functional performance. It used to be called PLOP, but now it's the big long one. If you did not mention reading on page 2, would you have a reading goal here? No, you would not. If you mentioned math on page 2, would you have a math goal here? Yes, if math was a struggle or a challenge for the student, you would have it here. If you mentioned speech language on page 2, would there be a speech language goal here? Yes. So you get how that works. Page 2 has to be very, very well done so you know what areas to make goals and objectives in. You don't want a goal and objective page if you didn't mention that area on page 2. Or you don't want to mention an area of challenge on page 2 and then not have a goal or objective for it. That's why the better you do page 2, the easier the rest of this is going to be. And that's why page 2 is so big and blank, because you can put lots of things in there. So when we do the goals and objectives, we have a measurable annual goal. And I kind of like to think of this, or this is what helps me, this is the big picture. So the student will improve their math addition from the current level of doing 1-digit addition plus 1-digit addition to the level of doing 4-digit plus 4-digit addition. That's pretty big. And then here you would have little objectives that help meet the big objective. So you might say, given 20 2-digit plus 2-digit numbers, the student will be able to complete them with 80% accuracy. Because if they can do 2-digit plus 2-digit, we're starting to reach that annual goal. And the next one might be 3-digit plus 3-digit. Or you might say, given a lesson on borrow or carrying, because in addition to be carrying, the student will be able to complete 10 problems with 100% accuracy. Because again, that would help towards the big goal of being able to add. Does that make sense a little bit? I see heads nodding yes. The other way you might look at this, maybe your big measurable annual goal is the student will improve reading fluency from the level of 10 words per minute to the level of 70 words per minute. Then some of your short-term objectives might be vocabulary words, because if you're exposed to more vocabulary words and you see them in reading, it's going to improve your fluency. If you're given instruction on vowel, consonant, vowel words, and you start to understand those, you see them in the reading, going to improve your reading fluency. So that's how those work. I'm going to show you an example. You can also find this on the South Dakota Department of Education website. They don't have it so you can save it, you can only look at it. But for every page of the IEP, they have actual examples for you on how to fill it out. So here's what they say to do on this goal page. They must include a condition. Let's just go up. The performance and the criteria specific to the child's present level of performance. You're going to get that present level of performance off of page 2. Again, they say don't use vague language. Use something that we can measure. So, some other words they ask you to be careful using is appropriate, improve, make progress, increase, decrease, acceptable grade level, and then participate in, to what extent. That's why you want it to be measurable. So you might say the student will improve their math skills from the level of adding 1 digit plus 1 digit to the level of doing 4 digit plus 4 digit, because now we know where we're starting and where we're going. Be very specific once again. So use your condition, the performance, the criteria when you do goals. This should be the same thing on your lesson plans. So general education teachers, when you're writing those lesson plans, you want to make sure that that's measurable too. The students in my class will be able to name 10 things about Egypt. Or the students in my class will be able to complete multiplication, single digit times single digit multiplication problems within 60 seconds, or 60 of them within 60 seconds. Very measurable. And they give you a lot of examples. So, when given 10 numbers of words, the student will say the initial, middle, and ending sounds with 80% accuracy in 10 consecutive trials. So those are some really good. Pull these up when you're writing your lesson plans and use this format, because you can't go wrong when you use it. Make sure it's very... Don't use the word understand in your lesson plan objectives. I see that so often, and you can't measure understand. Students will understand the political parties in Africa. How do you know they understand? So instead say students will be able to name the political parties in Africa and write 5 facts about each political party. Now you can measure that. So don't use the word understand either. That's the main part of your goals and objectives page. And again, if your present levels are done well, you'll very easily be able to write your goals and objectives, and then you'll be very easily able to instruct the student, because if you're working on adding math, you know exactly what to concentrate and focus on as a teacher. So we'll go back here to the IEP form. And again, this is the big picture up here, and the short-term objectives are little objectives that will help reach the big annual goal. Now, if you notice, they have procedural codes. Let's see if I can... Right here, let's see if this will work. Right here's for procedural codes, here's a date, here's how the progress is going, and here's for any teacher comments. Do you also notice up here we have the person responsible? So if this is adaptive PE things, the adaptive PE teacher's name is going to go there. If this is academics, it could be the special education teacher's name is going there. Possibly the general education teacher's name is going to go there. Speech language professional's name is going to go there. So we have to know who's responsible for fulfilling these goals. What do they mean by procedural codes, date, and progress? They have a little checklist right down here at the bottom of your page. How are you going to measure if the student is making progress towards that objective? And you can put a number in there, 1 through 10. Are you going to use teacher-made tests? Are you going to use observations, weekly tests, unit tests, conferences? So how are you going to measure that the student's actually making progress? And you have to actually put a number in there saying how you're going to measure that. The progress code is when you start looking at the data you're taking from whatever procedure you're using. Is progress being made, or are we not making progress? Is this not addressed? This reporting period, maybe you haven't gotten, you're still working on the 2-digit plus 2-digit, you haven't gotten to the 4-digit plus 4-digit yet. So you're not able to report on that because you're still back a ways. That's when you would use that X. Or maybe they met the goal, which is what we all hope. And then you can put the M. And then you would put that date. You also have to tell, how are you going to report to parents? How often are we required to report to parents how they're doing on the IEP? We have to have that big meeting once a year, but we're required to report to parents as often as we report to parents of general education students. How often is that typically? 4 times a year. Most schools send out report cards like quarterly. Is that what most of your schools did? So then we have to send out a progress report on the IEP quarterly, just like we do with the report cards. And so that's when you're going to go through, fill out your progress codes there and say, here's where we're at with these goals and objectives. This is the other big part of the goals page, is any accommodations and modifications or supplementary aids and services that need to be used to help them reach that goal. Are we going to let the student use a calculator? That depends on the student, depends on what the team decides. Then let's just pretend we are in this case. Student will use a calculator for all addition problems. Frequency, all math classes. The location, general education classrooms, when it begins, the duration. So that's where special education teachers really need to know what you're doing in the general education classroom. And general education teachers, you need to be a part of this. Because let's just pretend you have an essay question exam at the end of every history chapter. And this student has a writing, challenges with writing. Then you're going to want to be a part of, are you going to let them use the computer with spell check for those essays? Are you going to let them tell somebody and that person writes down what they're saying? Let's just pretend it was only in history class that was going to happen, and pretend we now have a writing goal up here, not a math goal up above. Then you would put student will type all written work on the computer. Frequency, essay, questions, location, history class. When it would begin, when it would end. Teachers, if it's on this page, which I don't know why my page is dull like that, you need to follow it. If it says the student will leave algebra to take exams in a quiet environment in the resource room, then you need to make sure the student does that. So whatever it says on this page is what you need to follow as a general education teacher. It's one of the first things I'd look at when I'm handed IEPs of the students in my classes. So you kind of know what types of modifications does a student need. Does anybody know what just happened here?
It's not responding.
Okay. First thing we're going to do here is pause. Did you also notice on page 5 that there was a line after page 5 that was the goals and objectives page? Let's see. Why would that be? Why is there that line right here? Oh. You can have multiple pages. And so if we have adaptive PE teacher's going to have a page. Theirs might be 5A. And the speech language might be 5B. And the math goal might be page 5C. And the behavior goal might be page 5D. And so depending on how many goals the student has, you'd have a different page for all of them. You don't want to get too many because there's only so many things you can work on in a given year. We'll get to page 6. Okay. Page 6 is your related services. What other specialists or services does the student need? You would check them here. You can see there's a whole large list. You have the title of the person responsible, how much service will they be given, where will the service be located, do they have to leave the school building and go to a counseling service, or is it actually counseling within the school building, and how long will it last if it's going to not last the whole year that the IEP is in effect. And there is a lot of different services. Do you see this one here, transportation? Specify when, how often, where, distance, cost, etc. Had a young man used an electric wheelchair. He also needed physical therapy at the swimming pool. The swimming pool in our town was not connected with the school district in any way. So they had to have the special bus with the wheelchair ramp come pick him up, take him to the swimming pool building. They did their adaptive PE in the pool. The wheelchair, then the transportation bus would come back, take him back to the school. The same bus also picked him up in the morning and took him home at night because obviously his wheelchair would not go into a typical school bus. This went on for an entire year. Somebody forgot to write it here. Because the student had been in the school district for several years, it was on past IEPs, just kind of forgot to add it to the new IEP. Came time, at the end of the school year, the school business manager was filling out reimbursement forms, as she had done every year, to get some reimbursement for the transportation cost. It wasn't on the current IEP. So technically speaking, could the school get reimbursement costs? No. Technically speaking, the student shouldn't have been riding that particular bus because it wasn't on this form. Luckily, there was enough of a history that they were able, the state let them backdate the paperwork and amend it and add it, but it was a big to-do because it wasn't in here. So if the school is responsible for funding any of these services, they need to be on here. So don't overlook them. Also, they need to be on here so that parents are aware. Parents don't want to find out, well, yeah, your student's been coming out a half an hour a week seeing a counselor in the school counseling office, and it wasn't on here. Because then we didn't technically have the permission for that to be happening. So make sure that it's on here. If it's on here, schools are responsible to help with those services. And here is page 7. We're getting closer. This is where we once again address the state and district assessments and any accommodations the student needs. So we have to check box 1 or box 2. The student will take the assessment without accommodations, or the student will take the assessment with accommodations. What's the difference between modifications and accommodations?
Modifications actually change the test itself, or accommodations just change how the student takes the test.
Exactly. Modifications change the test itself, where accommodations just change the way the student takes it. And modifications might change the rigor of the test as well. So it might not be as difficult. That's the big difference there. And you have to check that box. It's important to check that box early because we have to alert states several months in advance if a student needs an accommodation. Some accommodations that you might think of is if a student needs the test in Braille. That would be an accommodation. Doesn't change the test, changes the way the student takes the test. Maybe a student needs it in shorter segments. Do you all remember those tests where you had to break open the seal? Or I guess a lot of them are on the computer now, aren't they? And then you had to finish that whole section before you could take a break. Well, for students who maybe need it in smaller chunks, they can actually make it so they answer 10 questions, then there's a break. Then they answer 10 more questions, then they get another break type thing. Doesn't change the test. It just gives them more breaks in between. So that could be an example of accommodation. Then you have to actually list exactly what those accommodations will be for each test for the student. And then here's alternate assessment. Remember, again, this is very, very rare. A student has to have severe cognitive delays in order to qualify to take an alternate assessment. All accommodations documented in the IEP are allowed to be used for students taking the alternate assessment. Here's another area, teachers, you have to be kind of careful. If the student is never pulled out of the general education classroom to take tests that take place in the general education classroom, but then all of a sudden for the state test, you want them pulled out into a quiet room, would that make sense? You don't pull them out for any other test, but all of a sudden you want to pull them out for this test. If the student isn't given more breaks during typical tests, would it make sense that they all of a sudden need one for the state test? Probably not. So that's one thing that's going to be monitored fairly closely too.
With the alternate assessment, do they have to submit that to have it kind of approved for it to be considered an alternate, or do they just have to make one of their own?
There's a lot of forms that go with it, what the alternate assessment would be. I'm really not sure what the process is right now because it seems like it's changed all the time. My understanding is that it will be something related to the IEP, would be the alternate assessment, and that there has to be proof of how the student has grown in that area. So it really depends on the area. Task analysis are great to use. There just has to be strong documentation of some sort, but it's going to vary so much depending on the student. And I would guess, yes, that there has to be some kind of approval. Also, my understanding is that if a student takes an alternate assessment, they are automatically, for the most part, except for 1% of students, considered non-proficient for the school district. So if a student's taken an alternate assessment and it's more than 1% of the class, and even though they might be gaining in what we asked is their alternate assessment, they're still considered non-proficient for the school district, is my understanding of how that works. Because what they didn't want to happen was a lot of schools saying, well, we should be able to get him alternate assessment, we should be able to get her alternate assessment, we should be able to get this group over here alternate assessment, and then it's going to look like all of our students are proficient, when in reality they're not taking the actual standardized test. So 1% of a class can be considered proficient on the alternate assessment unless they've changed it again. And you can see how fast these things change. I mean, they've updated something in July, they updated something in August. It changes very fast.
I have a question.
Yep.
Maybe another question. Do special education classes take state tests then?
To special education, yes. You mean the students in K-12? Yes. They take the same test that the...
How is that fair?
I
That doesn't make sense. Does it?
Well, they're saying that no child should be left behind, and they mean no child, and so they want every child to be able to accomplish those things that they've deemed important on the state test.
But what if they're not possible?
Then you would do this alternate assessment, but remember you can only do an alternate assessment with those with severe cognitive delays.
So, what do you say?
Somebody with severe cognitive delays means that they have an impairment that's so severe that they couldn't function taking that standardized test.
So what about like kids with autism?
It would be an individual decision by the team if that student's able to take the state test or not take the state test. Some students with autism will do awesome on the standardized test. Other students might not do so well, or maybe they're not able to do it for some reason. But it's going to be a team decision. But by and large, they have to take the same test.
Are some decisions majority rules, or do they have to be unanimous?
Majority rules typically, but there's a spot where if you disagree, that they ask, you're allowed to disagree. So say the majority says, no, we think the least restrictive environment is in the general education classroom, but there's a few teachers that say, I really am opposed to that. I think we need some pull-out time to the resource room. Then you would write that. There's an actual place where you would say, you check, I disagree with the least restrictive environment that the team decided on, and the reason I disagree is because whatever reason. So you can disagree, but they'll usually go by majority rules. And typically, parents have a pretty big influence on that. The schools try to work with the parents.
So if the parents are the ones that disagree, then that'd be a bigger issue than if just one of the other teachers did?
Generally speaking, yes. If the parents disagreed, and they were the ones that disagreed and the school still placed them in another area, the parents have South Dakota advocacy, or in every state has something similar to South Dakota advocacy. They might request mediation, and then if the parents aren't happy,
And then that whole thing would end up on the website about being compliant or not compliant.
it could, yes. If the parents are not happy, it could go all the way to being compliant or not compliant. How far the parents want to push it. And this is probably as good a time as any to bring up a least restrictive environment scenario that I experienced to a certain extent. Did I tell you that one already? The young man who was typically developing till about the age of 3. Did I share that with you? And then about the age of 3, he was starting to act differently, and his parents took him in. Long and short of it, he was diagnosed with something that was going to continue to get worse, like a degenerative disease. And so he started to regress in the skills that he had. We'll move up to 4th grade now. By the time he was in 4th grade, he needed assistance walking, and they had like a gait belt on him, a belt around his waist that you would help to support him and walk with him. He was having more difficulty with fine motor skills, so holding silverware, holding pencils, holding color crayons. He had pretty much become nonverbal. He would still make sounds and those type of indications, but he had pretty much lost his ability to speak. He was still doing really well, grasping larger objects. You could put Velcro on things like gloves, use like felt gloves and then put Velcro on objects, and that would really help him pick up or manipulate those type of objects. The school district said, we have better equipment at another building within our district, the high school building. Well, there was a self-contained classroom with high school students with more severe disabilities, and also a teacher who was trained to work with students with more severe disabilities. The parents said, we don't want him pulled out of the elementary school. We want him here around peers his own age. We want him to experience the music class, the art classes, the colors you see in elementary school, having recess, going outside, feeling the fresh air. He was in a wheelchair when he wasn't supported because he couldn't walk alone, so he also had a wheelchair. And we just plain want him around his own age group because there's more laughter, there's more smiles, there's more stuff going on. And the school district said, well, we want to move him to the self-contained classroom in the high school building with a more certified teacher. So, if you were on the IEP team, which way would you lean?
Would you be able to say, like, leave them in the elementary school for like a couple more years, let them have that experience, and then, like, say once he gets to like middle school or whatever, then move him over to the high school where he's better suited?
You could say that. Remember, we do these every year, so you're really just dealing with that year.
Well, then it would be to leave him in the.
So you would say leave him in the elementary school. How many of you would say leave him in the elementary school? The majority of you. How many of you think, hey, if there's a certified teacher, there's better equipment in that other building, let's move him to that self-contained classroom? Nobody. Usually there's a few. Okay, yeah, usually there's a few. So what are some benefits of that?
The child would have more opportunity, to be able to do the things that he can't do in the other classroom.
Okay.
Give him more of a sense of accomplishment, I guess, since he doesn't really have the motor skills to pick up, but it's more obvious and then it's more equipped and probably more appropriate for him.
So the room would have better equipment that he can manipulate more, work with him. Yeah. This particular situation never got as far as quarter mediation. The school actually backed down quite a bit. The parents compromised quite a bit because, in small communities, it's not like parents are out to sue their school district. It's just an icky situation for everybody. So what was decided is the majority of his time he was still in the elementary school, but he did ride a bus over to the high school self-contained classroom a couple of hours a week, like a couple days. He'd go over there for like an hour, hour and a half, and do some of those things. I speculate, and of course I'll never know for sure what a court would have ruled. I'm guessing that the court would have ruled in favor of the parents because of least restrictive environment and zero reject. Schools cannot not serve a student. They're responsible to provide the right care, right down to nursing. We learned through the Tatro case and the Garrett case. So I don't know. But then again, you get the appropriate in there. The school was offering services that could be deemed appropriate, but it wasn't in the least restrictive environment. I don't know what the courts would have done had it gone that far. But those are some situations you'll face in the area of least restrictive environment. Not that often, but they do come up. Emotional behavior disturbances, they come up quite often. Self-contained classroom versus 24-hour residential facility versus general education classroom, and those are some big decisions. Removing a student from the school and putting them in a self-contained area or a different place. And we'll talk more about that during our emotional behavioral chapter 2. I'm going to stop because this page is extremely important, and because you guys are so excited about this IEP, it's probably good for a break here. And I need to move around. All right, so we're on page 8 of the IEP, which is the least restrictive environment, and the whole page deals with least restrictive environment. If we back up and we go to the South Dakota Department of Education website, which is where we've been, they don't have this in Word document, they have it in PDF, and you have to go back. But it's that IEP page that I've been taking you to where we found the form. And then it's justification statements right here. It tells you everything you need to know to fill out the least restrictive environment page on the IEP. Here's what has to be on there. An explanation of the extent, if any, to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the regular classroom in the activities described in paragraph of this section. The IEP team must provide a written justification regarding their decision to place the student in any setting outside the regular classroom. So in other words, if the IEP team says, hey, we think the student is best served in the resource room, or we think the student is best served in a separate classroom other than the general education classroom, then we have to have a strong justification explaining why that is benefiting the student. We can't just place them there without having this written statement. Removal from the regular education classroom shall occur when the nature or severity of the child's needs is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And then, as you can see, they're going to have us use this accept, reject format. So let's go back to our IEP.
I have a question.
Good.
Where was that at? I know about the website, but where?
Where was that page found? I'll go back to the website.
Oh, never mind.
I can show you. That's fine, because others might have the same question. Right here, you have to go back because it's not a Word document. And it's called the justification statements. It would be ideal if they would title it least restrictive environment page, but they don't. They call it justification statements. But it's all the directions for filling out the least restrictive environment page of the IEP. So let's go back to page 8 of our IEP, least restrictive environment. The first thing we have to do is look at the continuum of placement options up here in the corner. And you can see that there is the general education classroom with modifications, 80 to 100%, the resource room, self-contained classroom, separate day school, residential facility, home hospital. We have to decide as a team which one of those is going to be the most appropriate for the student, with the intentions of keeping them with their general education peers to the maximum extent appropriate. Let's pretend that we are going to put somebody in a self-contained classroom. Well, number one, if you're going to put somebody in a self-contained classroom, remember page 2 where we write everything in the present levels? There better be some really good information in there showing that this student needs to be in a self-contained classroom. If we're saying, hey, they're trying really hard, they've shown improvement in math and reading, their behavior is very acceptable, there's no medical needs, and then we come back here and we put them in a self-contained classroom, is that going to make sense? Absolutely not. So again, the better you do with that present levels page, the easier the team is going to have making sure they're doing what's appropriate for the student. But we'll just pretend that our present levels support somebody being in a self-contained classroom. So that's a classroom in the school district, probably in the same building as their general education peers. You notice it says 0 to 39% of the time, so they're still not in there necessarily full time. They might still be having lunch with their general education peers. Maybe they're taking music class or something like that with their general education peers. And we can look, again, if this is for 3 to 5 year olds, that won't apply to most of us unless you're an early childhood special education teacher, or like possibly if you're a kindergarten teacher. Here's where we have to put the description of services to be provided. Well, if they're in a self-contained classroom, we might have social behavior skills. And then we're going to do 40 minutes a day. And it's going to be in the self-contained classroom within our district. Maybe there's speech language. That's a related service. And they're going to have this 35 minutes times twice a week type thing. But you're going to list all of those services that the student's going to receive. Maybe it's reading education. And you're going to fill out how often that's going to happen, 20 minutes a day times 5 days a week or something like that. This has to be filled out, this next section. When will the student participate with their general education peers who do not have a disability? Will they be participating in art, industrial technology, music, folk education, family consumer sciences, or is there other times that they'll be participating? And then any comments we have about that. Non-academic times, will they be participating in recess, health services, employment referrals, meals, counseling? Comments about that. A lot of schools have like character education. I don't know if they're considering that the counseling or if that's a program option, probably a program option, so you might put other character education up here. But if they're maybe seeing a counselor for counseling services, then it might be non-academic. And then any extracurricular activities. And any comments. And here, you notice, is another blank box. And when there is a blank box, that means we have to fill it in appropriately and accurately. So remember, we said that our student, and pretend we had justification because we filled out page 2 and we have a lot of reasons, is in the self-contained classroom. Go back to your help guide here. They want us to use the accept, reject format. And we have to actually list each environment that would be less restrictive above them. So obviously we always start with the general education classroom with modifications. The team rejected it. We need to put a statement right as to why the team rejected it. And it has to be a good statement that makes sense. And if we didn't choose the resource room, which we didn't, we have to say we rejected that. And we have to describe why we rejected that. The next one is self-contained classroom. We accepted that as a team, and we have to describe why we accepted that one. You cannot skip reasoning for anything above on the list, any environment above on the list that you didn't choose. You have to have reasoning for every single one. I encourage my students who are writing IEPs to make sure they also say the IEP team, and I like them to say the IEP team discussed and rejected this placement option because, and then have a strong justification. So it's very clear that it was a team decision and not just one person's decision, such as the special education teacher. So you're going to have accept, accept, reject for ours with statements after each one. And they go on to say what should be in your justification statement. The written description should describe the student's instructional needs that resulted in the team's decision to remove the student from the general classroom setting. Do not necessarily restate the student's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance or the supplementary aids and services. For the options rejected, discuss the instructional strategies that were attempted and failed in that setting. For the options selected, specify the student's instructional needs that will be met in this placement category and why they cannot be met in any of the other above placement options. So it has to be very specific. The justification statement goes beyond a description of a preferred option, such as student needs better ratio than this option can provide. That's not a good justification statement. You know, the student will benefit from small group instruction. That's not a real strong justification statement. What will be different in the small group instruction that the student will benefit from? What specifically will be done differently by a teacher teaching a small group versus a large group? Will the student be able to be asked more questions for comprehension? Will the student have more options to Answer, which again will promote comprehension. Will the student have more trials that they'll get to practice that will help them gain their skill? So you have to know all that. And the justification must clearly outline the IEP team's discussion with serious consideration given to potential harmful effects of removing the student from the general education setting from their peers. In South Dakota, let's jump back to our IEP. In South Dakota, the IEPs have this little box down here, and hopefully you all have your IEPs up too. The team addressed the potential harmful effects of the special education placement, and you're supposed to check the box that those harmful effects were discussed. Personally, as a special education teacher, that's not enough for me. It's not enough for me because I feel like, what if we missed something? What exactly did we discuss? What if the parents forgot we discussed them? What if we discussed them but it wasn't clear to the parents what we were actually saying? So I like a statement here that says the potential harmful effects of the special education placement were discussed. These were the potential harmful effects discussed. 1, if the student is pulled out every day for math, they will not be in the classroom for math instruction and may be getting a different curriculum. Or 2, if the student is pulled out every day during science class, they may not have the full science curriculum that the rest of the students have. That kind of thing. Because I doubt this happens very often, but I've heard of things like this happening. Schools were keeping the student in from recess. The parent didn't realize it. When everyone else was going out to recess, the student was going to the resource room. And so the student was not having recess. Well, that should be discussed on here. It should be clearly, and I personally think that's a horrible option. I don't recommend doing that at all, because humans need exercise, we need to move, and that's how brains function, is through all of that. Other things I've heard of happening is they were doing supplementary math instruction at a lower level, so the student was never taking general education math classes in the high school setting. Well, it came time to graduate, and it was like, oh, he never had this required course for graduation. Oops. Well, boy, that should have been discussed ahead of time. Or the student always took animal science in place of pretend biology, and biology was required for college acceptance. I'm making things up, but you can see these things have actually happened with different classes. Like, oh, you didn't get a foreign language. Well, the college you wanted to go to requires a foreign language, so so make sure you discuss all the harmful effects, and I really feel like they should be listed what you've talked about here. Because as a parent, I think IEP meetings are overwhelming. As a teacher, I think sometimes they can be, but especially as a parent. So you want that in writing. The fact that we just discussed them, people can forget what we actually discussed. Let's go back to our direction page again. And they give you unacceptable justifications. Oops. So don't use any of these as justifications. Like this, decisions based on availability of space. Don't use that. Or the classroom wasn't big enough. Or the student will have more. That's terrible. Terrible justification. Based on availability of related services. Well, we're going to move the student to the high school because we have better equipment there. The teacher's more qualified, that kind of thing. Because remember, schools are required to provide what services the student needs. Decision identical to all other students in that placement. What the monitoring team who comes and monitors the IEPs every year doesn't want to see is that every IEP is basically a cut and paste of the last one. The team discussed this decision, and this was rejected because whatever reason, and then it's the same thing on every IEP after that. The monitors don't want to see that. They want to make sure this is individualized, really talked about. Never should be because of administrative convenience. Should never be based on the disability category. Well, the student has autism, therefore all students with autism are served in the self-contained classroom. Don't say that, because children with autism are each individuals and each learn differently. Decisions based on non-academic or a non-individualized reason. So you don't use any of those as justifications. Make sure you have a clear one. And then look, they give us examples. If we can stop. They give us all types of examples here. And the list of examples goes on and on. So that's very helpful. That's your least restrictive environment page of the IEP, page 8. Jump back to our IEP. And here's page 9, the last page of the IEP. Yoo-hoo! We're almost done. This page is really exciting because it is only required for students who show that they may regress or go backward on a skill they have already learned. Then, if we have good documentation and proof that the student will regress in a skill, they may qualify for extended school year. Do you see that this isn't called summer school? How many of you have heard of summer school? The two get confused sometimes. The technical term when we're dealing with special education is extended school year. And only students who will regress in something they already learned can typically apply for extended school year. So they're either needed or not needed, or we're going to determine at a later date. And then we write the date there. What goals will we be working on? What services will they have? When will they begin? When will they end? How many minutes per week? And what is it based on? And you can see down here the two little stars, regression, recoupment, emerging skills, or maintenance of critical life skills. What they don't want us necessarily doing is using extended school year to teach new skills. They want us to use extended school year to maintain the skills the student already knows. An extended school year can look really different for everyone and from district to district. If we have a student who has really come a long way in requesting help, community type things, and we don't want them to regress over the summer, the school district might pay their fee to, say, swimming lessons, because that would be a life skill as well if they maintain, or their fee to like a little 4-H camp that's in town or something, to maintain those social skills that the student has already learned. So it could look like that, or it could be instruction at the school where a special educator is actually hired during the summer and they do it that way. So that's what extended school years is, and it only has to be filled out in depth for those who qualify. Otherwise you put not needed and you're done with that page. And then we need the parent and guardian's consent for initial placement only, meaning that IEPs written after that, I guess you could maybe go forward after so many days if the parents didn't send back a signature page. But I prefer to always get the parent signature just to make sure that we're all agreeing and understand everything that's been said. Last minute questions about the IEP? Clear as mud? Feel ready to dive in and write one? Oh, yes, you do. It's going to be fun. All right, let me turn this off and